Today, we're at a very special place, Old Sarum. It sits just outside of Salisbury, about 8 miles south of Stonehenge. And for 2,000 years, this has been a significant site. Where we're standing right now is where William the Conqueror received all the landowners of England to swear allegiance to him. And there's a reason he chose this. It's a significant spot. But let's roll back further. In 400 BC, the outer ramparts were built, probably to protect a small settlement and livestock. And that's just Middle Iron Age. By AD 43, the Romans had come, and they called Old Sarum Sorvia Dundum. It was occupied continuously from AD 43 right the way to the early 4th century. And they actually built 2 settlements inside of the ramparts. From the 6th to the 10th centuries, it was a religious centre and a defensive refuge. And after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Anglo Saxons occupied this, and there was a king actually based here as the centre of his kingdom. But in 1066, the Normans arrived. And straight away, Salisbury, or Old Sarum, was one of the most significant towns, and it was picked to be a castle. And straight away they got to work in typical Norman fashion. And just like many castles like Rochester and Berkhamsted, they came and built a castle where there'd previously been a castle. And they liked Motte and Bailey, so they had a moat around. Then there was a second mound. Then there was where the common man was. Then there was a small hill, and on top of that hill was the actual castle for the Lord, where everyone could retreat if they were under attack. By 1100, the Normans had built a cathedral. And they'd renamed the castle. It was called Salisbury. It was a beautiful cathedral, which there's very little of today, although in the 1920s the outline was discovered. And the church, because it had Norman clergy, or certainly leadership, allowed the Normans to enforce their position in Britain. Because there was only a small Norman population, it was never more than about 15,000, but they had all the positions of power, and they controlled the nobility, obviously the royalty, but they also controlled the church. So most of the priests might have been Anglo Saxon, but all of the senior ones were Norman, and this allowed them to control the sort of 2 legs to the stool of medieval society. And the Normans didn't arrive without dispute. In the north in particular there were risings, and it led to the very brutal harrowing of the north, where tens of thousands of British were killed by the Normans. And at the end of it, the Doomsday Book was being written, the north had been destroyed, people who challenged William were on their knees. And he decided, in typical William the Conqueror style, that the best approach was to bring all the landowners of Britain and make them kneel at his feet as he sat under a catafalque on a throne. And that's exactly what he did. And he did it here, just outside the ramp that leads up to the castle in the centre, the Bailey. He sat down, and over the course of a couple of days received all the major landowners of England and had them swear loyalty to him. And this helped to enforce his power. And this castle has often been about power. There's the power of the Romans enforcing their position over the indigenous British. Then the Anglo Saxons came and they repeated the process. The Normans came and they repeated the process. And all the time the castle was growing here under the Normans, and also the cathedral. And the cathedral became a very significant religious site. Now, it was known to be a religious site under the Saxons, but there's just not really much left for us to be sure what stood here. But what we can see, thanks to the 1920s excavations, is the outline of a fairly substantial church. It was a cathedral. By today's standards, it was a very small cathedral, but it was certainly a very sizable church, especially when there were only about 36 monks there. If you compare it to, say, Buildwas Abbey, it's pretty much the same size, a little bit bigger, but not much. And sitting up on this hill must have been a wonderful place to come on a Sunday for Mass. But people actually lived here. There was a small town around the cathedral, really just a large village. However, there was a fatal flaw to this. If you look around, if I don't point the camera up too much, you can see there's not very much for a very long way. So it's a very exposed, windy place. And there's no river, there's no water source. Although they did dig a well, there wasn't really enough for more than a handful of people to live off. So it might have been fine for the Anglo Saxons. But as this castle grew and it started to have hundreds of people living here, it really wasn't enough. But the Normans doubled down. Henry I rebuilt the whole cathedral, and he built it in stone, and next to it a stone keep. And it took from 1100 to 1139, but he got his impressive cathedral. Today, the bit we have an outline of only extends to the nave, but that's about half the size of the real church. And it was quite tall, with a large bell tower, nothing compared to Salisbury today, but certainly pretty substantial. And Bishop Roger was quite a key character here, and he was a wealthy man, and he built the cathedral to be a centre of power. Well, by the 1170s, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine was arrested for treason, and Henry II placed her here, and she lived in Old Sarum in the castle, and she worshipped at the cathedral. But it was still problematic that there wasn't enough water. By the 1190s, the clergy decided it just wasn't a good place for the cathedral. So they abandoned it and they left it empty. They didn't demolish it. By the 1220s, they built the new cathedral. And Bishop Richard Poore laid the stones for New Sarum. New Sarum is why Sarum became Old Sarum. And at the bottom of the hill, on the edge of the floodplain, they built one of the most magnificent cathedrals in Britain. It was the tallest building in the world for about a century. You may remember the Russian spies who came to Salisbury, and their explanation for being there was that they weren't poisoning people, but they had to see the spire because it's such a significant building in architectural history. Well, it really is significant. But 1240, 20 years later, they moved full-time down to Salisbury, and New Sarum became Salisbury, and the old cathedral was mainly demolished and the stones were carried down to the valley and used to construct buildings around the cathedral. But with a water source, and a wealthy cathedral, Salisbury began to grow very quickly. But Old Sarum didn't go away. It was still a castle. It was still functional. And all the way through to Henry VIII, there was a castle there, and a royal castle. By the time Henry VIII came around, 1514, they gave all of the material away. So it was sold or granted. It was used to extend power by giving people beneficence. And in 1514, Old Sarum was an empty shell, a very steep hill with a flat top and the outline of a Motte and Bailey castle. In many ways, it looked like a lot of Norman castles do today. Just an abandoned pile of stones on top of a big hill. But Parliament's always been a funny thing. Parliament has always had an elected seat. So a Minister of Parliament is elected by the people who are allowed to vote in an area, and they sit in Parliament. Now today we have committees that draw borders and that make sure that we have a pretty equal amount of people in every constituency. There's the odd one like the Isle of Wight where it was a bit too big for one constituency, a bit too small for others. But fundamentally, they're all drawn up to have the same number of people living in a seat. Well, back then, there was no such finesse about the process, and a significant, important town needed to have seats in Parliament. So Old Sarum was a rotten borough for just under 300 years. And what that meant was that the landowner who owned Old Sarum got to select 2 MPs in every parliament. So whereas now there's about 600 MPs, there are about 300. And if you owned the hill at Old Sarum, you could select 2 of them. It's still a significant site, but it's very much in ruins. You can make out the walls of some of the buildings. So like over here to the left is the chapel. So the King's Chapel. And you can see the outline of where the altar was, the structure of the buildings. You get a pretty good idea where the doors were. There's no first floor. There's no minor buildings. And a lot of it's been removed. But you can still see the overall structure. It's been maintained by the stones that weren't worth dragging away. All the dressing is gone, all the stones on the outside that made it truly a defensible position and a beautiful fortress. They're all long gone thanks to Henry VIII. But it's still not unimpressive. It's quite a large site. And it was pretty slippy the day I went. There was a snowfall, but really it was more a frost. The snow's from the day before. One of the things I saw with it being frosty was that although you're very much on the top of the hill, you're so high up, there are parts of the land around which don't really get sunshine other than in the morning. It casts its own shadow across a lot of the surrounding field. Here a little piece of the stone dressing. It must have been an impressive sight. Would have been much larger than it is today. Here are the toilets. You don't want the job of cleaning those. In the absence of running water and modern plumbing, there was a large hole lined with brick on either side. People would go to the toilet over it. This field here is where William the Conqueror had the landowners come and pay allegiance to him. And you can see another reason he chose this. This is pretty large. If you saw our video on Castle Acre, it's a similar Motte and Bailey layout, but it's nowhere near as substantial as this. And again, if you go somewhere like Berkhamsted or a lot of the Norman castles that were Motte and Bailey, you can see how they had some houses and they had maybe 50 people staying there. But here, this was a town inside this wall. And as we come up onto the top, we can see down to Salisbury. And it's really not very far. It's almost a funny situation that the new town was founded almost within the shadow of the old town. Deliberately planned obsolescence of this structure. And you always have to imagine, when you see a Motte and Bailey like this or a ditch, you always have to imagine that it was a lot deeper than it is today. Now, the ones around Stonehenge or Avebury, they always say they were 2 to 3 times deeper. This probably not twice as deep, but it would have been a little bit deeper. It has filled in a bit. And you can walk all the way round. I did laugh because the day I went here, I went to Stonehenge. And at Stonehenge, they were so worried about people slipping that they closed off 2 of the 4 sides. Really more than 2. So you could only actually go past a small part of the stones. They didn't reduce the ticket price. But when you came here, I wasn't told don't go up on that slippy mound. I was just told be careful of your footing. And it was a little bit slippy because this is just compacted mud. It's an earth wall that's been here for 1,000 years. But as you walk around, it's slippy. The surface is very muddy after a rainfall. And you can imagine with the frost, it was a bit on the slippy side. Now we're just going to go around the inner, but you can see the outer wall is also accessible. And it's large. It takes about 10 minutes to walk all the way around. And today it's open. It's free for you to go in until you reach the bridge up to the castle. And the car park you do pay for, although I got the impression the locals don't. But the castle itself is English heritage and carries an entry price. I think it's quite well worth it, but like all English heritage sites, if you want to go to quite a few of them, joining English heritage is a lot cheaper than going to them piecemeal. You can see quite a wide rampart here. Presumably there would have been a wooden stockade around this in Anglo Saxon and Norman times. Maybe even a wall and points in the Roman times. But no sign of any Roman bricks, so I'm going to guess that it was a wooden structure in Roman times. Because where you had Roman bricks, you can always see some remain of those bricks in the fabric of the building. You see it with the castle at Colchester, where it was the Temple of Saturn and was used as the foundations for the Norman castle. Or if you go to Pevensey, where the outer wall is a mixture of Roman and post-Roman, and you can clearly see the Roman contribution. Here there's none of that at all. It does look like what was taken away was dressed stone. But for 2,000 years, an important site. It's been at the centre of politics because of power and influence of a castle across multiple ages, but also a great defensible location to make your lords come and grovel and kiss the foot, as William Conqueror made sure to do here. And then lasting on, it's the only castle I know of which, when the days of castles were gone and the Reformation had destroyed much of the church's power and seized much of its assets, it lasted on with seats in Parliament. In fact, when Salisbury had 1 seat, Old Sarum had 2. The logic behind this was that when the town declined, the borough was organised with what was called a burgage franchise, which was that inhabitants of designated houses were the burghers and they had the right to vote. So as less people lived in those, less people got to vote. And then a family you might have heard of, the Pitt family, bought it. And it became known as their pocket borough, because one of the MPs from it was no less than William Pitt the Elder. He was a British Whig statesman. He was actually Prime Minister from 1766 to 1768. And not an insignificant character, considering he wasn't really voted in by anyone. Well, in 1802, Lord Camelford sold the borough to the Earl of Caledon, and he owned it right the way up until its abolition in 1832 by the Reform Act. He purchased that land for £60,000, which obviously in money at the time, which is a lot of money today. But if you consider that all of the land and manors in that constituency bought in £700 a year. So you can see that what they were really buying was what came to be known as a wall with 2 niches. Those 2 niches were parliamentary seats. So the Reform Act finally put an end to it, and it subsumed the old Sarum area into the borough of Wilton. Old Sarum actually became the most famous of the rotten boroughs, and when there was an election, crowds would gather to watch the election process, because instead of putting ballots in a box, 2 candidates would be presented, then there would be a call for further nominations, and then the landowner would tell them who'd got the 2 jobs. In 1802 there was an election, and Duke Smith was there. This is what he wrote. He said, "The election for the borough of Old Sarum was held in a temporary booth erected in a cornfield, under a tree which marked the former boundary of the old town, not a vestige of which has been standing in the memory of man. The several burgages, which give the right of voting, being now without a dwelling for a human being. Mr. Dean, the bailiff of the borough, having read the precept for the election, and caused proclamation thereof, read the Bribery Act, and gone through all the legal ceremonies, the Reverend Dr. Skinner rose and nominated Nicholas Vansittart and Henry Alexander, from a thorough conviction their public conduct would be such as would give satisfaction and do honour to their constituents." The other electors acquiescing to this nomination, and no other candidates offering the proclamation, was thrice made for any gentleman disposed to do so. And at this point there were 5 electors who were present in 1802. The Reverend Dr. Skinner, the Reverend Mr. Borough, Williams Dyke, Mr. Massey and Mr. Brunsden, and they all owned land within the borough, and as a result they chose 2 ministers of Parliament. but it was all done in accordance with the law. And until 1905, you could actually go to the tree where they would sit and do the election. So this is what's left of the old cathedral. You can see it was underground and it's been excavated. Concrete's been put so you can see the structure of where the columns were, but it gives you the basic outline of the nave. And it must have been an impressive church considering its height. There's some lovely pictures there that you can have a look at. But really, a major cathedral lost to time. I can't think of another cathedral of which so little remains. In fact, the day it opened, it was damaged by a storm and had to be closed and renovated before it had even been open a week. So it's always been a slightly unlucky place, but very lucky if you owned the land. And a cathedral abandoned to build another one just 2 miles away. It's certainly not as impressive as Salisbury Cathedral, and if you do come here, you should definitely go down to town and check out the medieval quarter, what remains of it. There's actually a Ted Heath Museum of all things. I didn't have time to make it to that, but it's on my list for a future visit. And this is all that remains of the cathedral. To the side there's a small dip, and you can see the overall structure of a square. That would have been the cloisters for the cathedral. But really it's rubble and concrete outlines to give you an idea of what the cathedral was like. A sad memory of what must have been a very grand building. And best seen from up in the castle. Although you can walk through it here, you can barely make out the outline, whereas from up in the castle you got quite a view earlier on. So it's a very important place, Old Sarum. It's an interesting place to visit. There's the cloisters down there. Interesting place to visit, but really it's got a unique history where it was a centre of power for the Anglo Saxons, for the Romans, for the Normans, the Tudors, and a cathedral which disappeared, and also the whole rotten boroughs, where there were other rotten boroughs, but Old Sarum was a particularly rotten borough. If you've ever get the chance to watch Blackadder, there's a very funny episode where he needs to change a law or make sure it doesn't get voted for, and they stand Baldrick for a rotten borough. And Baldrick gets elected because he's the best candidate. Unfortunately, he's also an idiot, so he votes the wrong way. And this is what I meant by the shadow, where you can see that a lot of the fields here never get kissed by the sun during the day because they're in the shadow of this hill, which it's hard to appreciate when you're filming it on video. But when you actually see it, it's a very steep, big hill. And its substantial size really does make it ideal for a castle. I hope you enjoyed the wander through Old Sarum with so much history going back so far. And if you subscribe, we'll be back on Monday with another Monday museum tour, and next week on Saturday with another Unbound History.